Welcome to the Monotone Museum. Tonight's exhibit is about Hugh Glass. If you enjoy calm, carefully told history, please like and subscribe to help preserve these stories. Now, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight we are going somewhere cold, somewhere vast and empty and magnificent and dangerous. We are going to the American frontier in the 1820s. To a world of mountain men and grizzly bears and rivers no white person had ever mapped. A world where the nearest settlement might be 500 miles away and the nearest human being might be no one you wanted to meet. We are going to follow a man about whom we know almost nothing for certain. His birth date, his birthplace, his appearance, even his full name are matters of historical uncertainty. And yet whose story is so extraordinary, so physically improbable, so psychologically profound, that it has been told and retold for 200 years and still does not lose its power. His name was Hugh Glass. And what happened to him in the late summer of 1823 in the wilderness of what is now South Dakota is one of the most astonishing things a human body has ever survived. Close your eyes. Let the warmth of your bed become the warmth of a campfire. Let the darkness become the darkness of a wilderness night, full of stars. We are going in. Here is the first honest thing we must say about Hugh Glass. We do not know very much about him before the bear. His birth year is estimated at around 1783, which would have made him approximately 40 years old at the time of the attack. Some historians place him earlier, some later. His birthplace is not recorded with certainty. Pennsylvania is the most common suggestion, based on sparse evidence. What he did between birth and his arrival on the Missouri River frontier in the early 1820s is a matter of legend, rumor, and at least one story so extraordinary that most historians have treated it with polite skepticism while being unable to entirely dismiss it. The story goes like this. As a young man, Hugh Glass was captured by the Pawnee people of the Central Plains, taken by some accounts during a pirate raid on the Gulf Coast in which he had been a reluctant participant, having been press-ganged into the crew of the pirate Jean Lafitte. He allegedly escaped from Lafitte's ship by swimming to shore in Texas or Louisiana, made his way inland, and was captured by the Pawnee chief Les Celesches band somewhere on the Republican River in Kansas or Nebraska. Instead of being killed, he was adopted. He learned the Pawnee language. He lived among them for several years, hunting, following the buffalo migrations, learning to move through the grassland world with the ease that only comes from actually living in it, rather than passing through. And then, eventually, he made his way back into the American settlements, carrying with him a knowledge of plains life that very few white Americans possessed. How much of this is true is impossible to say. What is true is that by the early 1820s, Hugh Glass was in St. Louis, and St. Louis was the launching point of the American fur trade, the city where men came to outfit themselves and find employment with the great fur companies that were pushing into the Rocky Mountains and the upper Missouri River country in search of beaver pelts. He was, by all accounts, an impressive physical specimen, big, experienced, weathered, with the particular competence of a man who has spent years in conditions that weed out incompetence efficiently. He knew how to hunt, he knew how to read country, he knew how to take care of himself in the wilderness in ways that younger, greener men did not. He signed on with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, which was being organized in 1822 and 1823 by two St. Louis businessmen named William Henry Ashley and Andrew Henry. Ashley and Henry's enterprise would become one of the most important and consequential fur trade operations in American history. Not because it was the largest, but because of the extraordinary collection of men it employed. The roster of Ashley Henry trappers reads like a who's who of the American frontier: Jedediah Smith, the deeply religious explorer who would become the first American to cross the Sierra Nevada; Jim Bridger, who would become perhaps the most celebrated mountain man after Kit Carson; Thomas Fitzpatrick, William Sublette, and Hugh Glass. These men gathered in the spring of 1823 to ascend the Missouri River by keelboat, the brutally difficult, upstream against the current journey into the heart of the continent. The keelboat was pushed and poled and pulled by ropes from the bank, making perhaps 15 miles on a good day against the Missouri's powerful current. The men worked in shifts, their muscles burning, the river fighting them every mile. Then the Arikara attacked. The Arikara, the Sanish as they called themselves, were a sedentary people who lived in fortified earth lodge villages on the upper Missouri, farming corn and beans and squash and trading with the nomadic tribes around them. They had extensive experience with the American fur trade, and that experience had not always been positive. Relationships had soured over years of slights, broken agreements, and the general high-handedness of American traders who tended to treat the Arikara as obstacles or employees rather than sovereign people on their own land. On June 2, 1823, the Ashley Henry expedition stopped at an Arikara village to trade for horses. They camped on the sandbar below the village. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 2nd, the Arikara opened fire. The attack was devastating. 15 men were killed in the initial volley and the chaos that followed. Many more were wounded. The survivors scrambled for the keelboats or swam for the far bank. The wounded who couldn't reach the boats were left behind. The expedition retreated downstream in disorder, their losses catastrophic by the standards of the small, tight-knit fur trade community. Hugh Glass survived the attack. He was probably wounded. Accounts differ. What is certain is that he was still with the company when it reorganized and pushed overland, away from the Missouri River, heading west and northwest into the Dakota Plains. He was heading toward the Grand River country of what is now northwestern South Dakota. He was heading toward the event that would define him entirely, the event from which everything else in his story flows. He was heading toward the bear. The party of trappers moved through the Grand River drainage in late August 1823, a landscape of rolling hills and breaks, of cottonwood-lined creek bottoms and high exposed ridgelines, of plum thickets and chokecherry bushes, heavy with late summer fruit. It was bear country. Everyone knew it was bear country. Grizzly bears in the 1820s ranged across the entire western half of the continent in numbers that are difficult to imagine now. The population before European contact has been estimated at perhaps 100,000 animals, occupying every ecosystem from the Arctic tundra to the deserts of Mexico. A grizzly bear is not simply a large animal. It is a different order of creature from most things a human being is likely to encounter. An adult male can weigh 800 pounds, can run 35 miles per hour for short distances, faster than any human alive, can smell a carcass from 20 miles away, can hear sounds well outside the range of human hearing, and is equipped with claws 4 inches long and a bite force of 1,200 pounds per square inch. It is virtually without natural predators. It has no concept of something in its environment that is too dangerous to attack. In the fur trade era, the grizzly bear was the most feared animal on the continent, and the mountain men's stories of grizzly encounters were the campfire tales that got told and retold most often with the most genuine feeling. These were men who were not easily frightened. They swam frozen rivers and crossed snowbound mountain passes and walked into Blackfoot territory knowing the odds. Grizzly bears frightened them. Hugh Glass went ahead of the main party. This was not unusual. Experienced men often moved ahead as scouts, hunting for game, checking the terrain. He pushed through a thicket of plum bushes along a creek bottom, probably watching for deer or elk, definitely not watching carefully enough for what was actually there. The grizzly was a sow, a female, with cubs. This is the most dangerous possible configuration. A grizzly sow with cubs is not aggressive in the way a predator is aggressive, calculating and patient. She is a force of nature responding to what she perceives as an existential threat to her offspring, and her response is total, immediate, and overwhelming. Glass almost certainly did not see her until she was already moving. She hit him with her full weight, 400 pounds or more of muscle and fur and fury, and the impact alone would have been enough to break bones. She bit into his neck and back. She shook him. She raked him with her front claws, the 4-inch hooks opening wounds across his scalp and back that exposed the bone beneath. He fought back. This is documented, or as documented as anything about Hugh Glass is, with his knife and with his bare hands, stabbing her repeatedly, and his companions heard the sounds of the struggle from a distance and came running and shot her, and she fell on top of him. They pulled her off. What they found underneath was a man who should have been dead. His scalp had been torn partially from his skull and hung loose at one side. His back was shredded to the spine in places, the white of vertebrae visible through the torn muscle. His throat had been bitten, and he was breathing in a way that made a wet, sucking sound with each inhalation, suggesting that his lung had been compromised. His right leg was broken. He had lost an amount of blood that no one who looked at him thought was survivable, but he was alive. His eyes were open. He was, impossibly, conscious. The expedition's captain was a man named Andrew Henry, practical and experienced, and faced with an impossible situation. The party was deep in hostile territory. The Arikara were somewhere behind them. The Blackfoot was somewhere ahead. They could not carry a dying man through this country, not without slowing their pace to a crawl, not without the noise of his suffering and the smell of his blood drawing attention, neither human nor animal of the wrong kind. And he was dying. Everyone agreed he was dying. There was no question in anyone's mind that Hugh Glass would be dead within days, if not hours. Henry made the decision that history has never quite forgiven him for, even though it was arguably the rational decision given the circumstances. He would pay 2 volunteers to stay with Glass until he died, give him a proper burial, and then catch up with the main party. 2 men volunteered. Their names have been debated by historians for 2 centuries. The most commonly cited identification is John Fitzgerald, an older, experienced trapper, calculating and pragmatic, and a young man variously identified as Jim Bridger, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated mountain men in history, or as another man entirely. The Bridger identification is not fully confirmed by historical evidence, though it has become part of the story's canonical telling, and Bridger himself, in old age, apparently admitted to abandoning Glass without ever fully explaining his reasons. They stayed for, the accounts vary, somewhere between 2 days and 5 days. Long enough for Glass's condition to seem hopeless, long enough for their own fear to become unbearable. They were alone in hostile country, responsible for a man who was not improving, surrounded by silence that might at any moment stop being silence. And then they took his rifle, his knife, his fire-making kit, his flint and steel, without which making fire on the plains was nearly impossible. Everything that might keep a man alive in the wilderness. And they walked away. He was still alive when they left. He woke up alone. We do not know exactly what Hugh Glass thought when consciousness returned, and he understood that the men left to tend him had gone. We do not know whether he called out for them, or whether some deeper instinct told him immediately that calling out was useless. We do not know whether he felt rage or despair, or the cold, crystalline clarity that sometimes descends on people in extremis, when the situation is so completely beyond ordinary human experience that ordinary human emotions seem beside the point. What we know is what he did. He was lying in a shallow, grave-like depression that his companions had apparently prepared for his body. His wounds were days old now, which meant they were infected. The frontier wilderness of 1823 was not a sterile environment, and deep wounds left open to air and earth and insects in late August heat became infected quickly and completely. He had no water. He had no fire. He had no knife to hunt with, no rifle, no way to signal for help even if help existed to be signaled. He had his body, his mind, and the will to use them. The first thing he needed was water. He was dehydrated. From blood loss and from the fever that had already taken hold, the body's inflammatory response to the infection working through his wounds. He moved toward the sound of the creek, crawling because he could not stand, because his right leg was broken and his back was in such condition that upright movement was impossible, crawling on his hands and his one good leg, dragging the broken one. This crawl, the first of many thousands of yards of crawl that would eventually cover approximately 200 miles, was excruciatingly painful. We know this not because Glass described it, but because anyone who has studied traumatic injury understands it. His wounds pulled and tore with every movement. The broken leg dragged across ground. His scalp, partially detached, must have been in a condition too terrible to describe in comfortable terms. Every motion was an act of will against a body screaming at him to stop. He reached the creek. He drank. He lay in the shallows for a while, letting the cold water do what cold water does for fever and inflammation, not curing anything, not even helping much, but providing something. A moment of relief, a reason to continue. The choke cherries along the creek bank were ripe. He ate them. The plum thickets, the same kind of thickets where the bear had found him, held fruit he could reach without standing. He ate. His stomach was probably not interested in food at this point, but his body needed calories. And he understood this, understood it at whatever level human beings understand the basic requirements of survival before language attaches to the understanding. Then he oriented himself. He knew where he was, roughly. He knew where the nearest outpost of American civilization was, Fort Kiowa on the Missouri River, approximately 200 miles to the southeast. He knew the country between here and there, the breaks and ravines of the Grand River drainage, the flat expanses of the Missouri Plateau, the river itself as landmark and guide. He pointed himself southeast and began to move. 200 miles. Let us spend a moment with that number, because it is easy to read past it without fully absorbing what it means. 200 miles is the distance from New York City to Boston. It is the distance from Los Angeles to San Diego and back. On a good road, in a car, it takes perhaps 3 hours. On foot, at a reasonable hiking pace of 15 to 20 miles per day, it takes 10 to 14 days. Hugh Glass covered this distance in approximately 6 weeks, crawling, with a broken leg, with infected wounds covering most of his back and scalp. Without a knife, without a rifle, without fire-making equipment, without any of the tools that separated a mountain man's survival from a slow death in the wilderness. In territory patrolled by the Arikara, who had already killed 15 of his companions and were not known for mercy towards solitary wounded white men they happened to encounter. The fact that he survived this journey is, medically and physically, and probabilistically, almost impossible to account for. Historians, physicians, and survival experts who have examined the documented details of the Glass case have repeatedly reached the same conclusion. By any reasonable analysis, he should have died, multiple times. And yet, he moved in those first weeks, primarily at dawn and dusk, when the light was enough to navigate by, but not enough to be easily spotted from a distance. He stayed near creek bottoms where water was available and the vegetation offered concealment, and where the small game that he needed to eat lived in the greatest concentrations. He could not hunt actively, he had no weapons, but he could opportunistically gather berries, roots that he knew were edible from years of plains experience, insects, which are a more reliable calorie source than most people know. And then, approximately a week into his journey, he found something that changed his situation materially. A grizzly bear had killed a bison calf and partially consumed it, and then abandoned the carcass. The wolves had found it. When Glass arrived, the wolves were feeding. He drove the wolves off the carcass. A man barely able to walk, armed with nothing but his own voice and whatever sticks he could reach from. The ground drove a pack of wolves off a fresh kill. This is documented, or as documented as anything in Hugh Glass's story is documented in the accounts recorded by fur trade contemporaries. The wolves retreated. Glass ate. He ate raw meat because he had no fire, and he ate as much as his shrunken stomach could hold, and then he ate more. And then he lay down next to the carcass in the September sun and slept. He understood something in those days that most people in the modern world never need to understand. That survival is not a dramatic act, but a continuous series of small, practical decisions. Drink when you find water. Eat when you find food. Rest when the pain becomes too great to move through. Orient yourself. Move. Repeat. There is no heroism in this. Exactly. Or rather, the heroism is so distributed across so many tiny moments that it doesn't feel like heroism from the inside. It feels like stubbornness. It feels like not being able to think of a reason to stop. The wounds on his back were doing something remarkable. In the late summer heat, flies had laid eggs in the exposed flesh, and the eggs had hatched into maggots. This is, by modern standards, actually beneficial. Maggot debridement, as it is known in medicine, involves the deliberate introduction of fly larvae into infected wounds, where they consume necrotic tissue exclusively, leaving healthy tissue intact and actually producing compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. Field surgeons in the Napoleonic Wars had noticed this phenomenon. Civil War surgeons would notice it again. Hugh Glass noticed it in 1823 in the South Dakota wilderness. He did not remove the maggots. He understood, at whatever level he processed such things, that they were doing useful work. This decision, made by an illiterate, gravely injured man alone in the wilderness with no medical training, made correctly, in accordance with what modern medicine would eventually confirm was the right call, is one of the small, extraordinary details of this story that refuses to be explained away. He was paying attention. He was thinking. He was using what he observed rather than reacting to it with revulsion. The broken leg was a more difficult problem. He could not set it himself, could not splint it properly. What he could do, and apparently did, was fashion a rough support, from sticks and strips of the raw hide and leather on his clothing, binding it tight enough to bear some weight if he used a staff. He found a heavy branch. He pulled himself upright, tested the leg, found it could bear partial weight in this fashion, and shifted from a crawl to a lurching, halting, agonizing walk. He moved faster, not much faster, but faster. Approximately 6 weeks after the bear attack, Hugh Glass reached the Missouri River. He had covered something close to 200 miles of broken, difficult terrain, through late summer heat and early autumn cold, through pain that never fully abated, through hunger and thirst and the constant low-level terror of moving through country where discovery by the wrong people meant death. He was thin, catastrophically thin, the kind of thin that happens when a body has been consuming its own muscle mass for fuel. His wounds had begun to close, slowly, in the uneven, scarring way that wounds close without medical attention. His leg had knit imperfectly, leaving him with a limp he would carry for the rest of his life. He was alive. At the Missouri River, he encountered a band of Lakota Sioux. This was not necessarily good news. The Sioux were not uniformly friendly to American trappers. The relationship was complicated and variable depending on the band, the circumstances, the individuals involved. A solitary, half-dead white man appearing on the riverbank was an ambiguous object. He could be killed. He could be helped. He could be ignored. He was helped. The Lakota band that found Glass took him in and tended to him, fed him, dressed his wounds with whatever medicines they had available, allowed him to rest. He spoke some Lakota or some Sioux dialect from his years of plains experience, and this may have been the decisive factor. He was not a stranger to them in the way that most white men were strangers, not a man who spoke only English and looked at them with the blank incomprehension of someone who had never made any effort to understand. He was something slightly different, a white man who had moved through their world long enough to learn some of its language and customs. This mattered. They gave him a canoe or helped him acquire one. They gave him food for the river journey, and they sent him on his way. He paddled the Missouri River downstream to Fort Kiowa, arriving sometime in late October or early November 1823, 6 weeks or so after the bear attack that should have killed him, 200 miles from where he had been left for dead. When he walked into Fort Kiowa, or was helped into Fort Kiowa, limping on his imperfectly healed leg, the men at the fort apparently stared at him in silence for a long moment. Several of them knew him. Several of them had assumed he was dead. He was, by one account, so changed by the ordeal, so thin, so scarred, his face so altered by what he had come through, that some of them did not recognize him immediately. He asked for food. He ate. He asked about John Fitzgerald and the young man who had been with him. He was told where they had gone. He rested for a few days, then he set out after them. The pursuit of the men who had abandoned him is one of the great sustained acts of will in frontier history, and it is made more interesting by the fact that it ended in a way that almost no one who hears the story expects. Fitzgerald and the young man, let us call him Bridger, as the tradition does, while acknowledging the historical uncertainty, had caught up with Andrew Henry's main party and continued with them into the mountains. Finding them was not going to be a simple task. The fur trade world was vast and mobile, its participants scattered across thousands of square miles of unmapped wilderness, moving constantly with the seasons and the trapping grounds. Glass followed. Anyway, his route took him back into the very country where the bear had attacked him, back through the Grand River drainage, through the Dakota breaks, through country that held the specific memories of his worst experience in a landscape full of difficult memories. He traveled this time with a small party, not alone. He had found companions at Fort Kiowa willing to travel the same direction, and he was better equipped. He had a rifle again, he had a knife, he had fire, he was attacked by the Arikara during this journey and narrowly escaped. He was caught in a winter storm in the Black Hills country and spent days sheltering in a rock overhang while the snow came down. He forded rivers that were already running cold with the beginning of winter, the kind of cold that turns fingers numb in minutes and slows the mind if you let it. He was not the same man who had crossed this country crawling 6 months earlier. He was still injured. He was still gaunt. But he was moving under his own power, with purpose, in the direction of the men who had robbed him and left him to die. What did he feel during those months of travel? The historical record does not say directly. The accounts that exist of Hugh Glass's thoughts and motivations come to us filtered through decades, through intermediaries, through the inevitable distortions of oral tradition and published reminiscence. What we have is a broad consensus. He wanted to find Fitzgerald and the young man. He wanted his rifle back, and he wanted, what? Revenge? Justice? To look them in the eye? To understand why? Probably all of these, in proportions that shifted as the months passed and the winter deepened, and the distance he had already covered began to accumulate into something that changed him, as great distances always change the people who travel, them. He found the young man first, at Fort Henry, in what is now Montana, in the winter of 1823 to 1824. The young man saw him coming and by some accounts went pale and could not speak. He had believed, perhaps had needed to believe, that Glass was dead. The alternative, the reality now standing in front of him at the fort, was something his mind had not fully prepared for. The man he had robbed and abandoned was here, alive, having crossed an impossible distance under impossible conditions and looking at him. What Hugh Glass said to him has not been definitively recorded. What is recorded, or as recorded as anything in this story is recorded, is the general shape of what happened. Glass confronted him. Glass berated him. The accounts use words like fierce and passionate to describe the tongue-lashing Glass. Delivered. The young man said very little in his own defense. He was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, and he had made a terrible choice under terrible pressure, and now he was standing in front of the consequence of that choice, which had somehow walked 200 miles to find him, and then Hugh Glass let him go. He did not kill him. He did not demand official punishment. He looked at the young man's youth, or was moved by some consideration the record has not preserved, and he made the decision that is the most surprising and in some ways the most revealing thing in this entire extraordinary story. He forgave him. Or if not forgave him exactly, forgiveness is a complicated internal state, not something easily verified from outside. He chose not to pursue vengeance against him. He took back his rifle, and he let the young man live. John Fitzgerald was a different matter. If the young man's abandonment had been driven by fear, the fear of a teenager alone in hostile country, watching a man die slowly, losing his nerve, Fitzgerald's abandonment appeared to be something more calculated. He was older, more experienced, and the decision to take Glass's possibles, his rifle, his knife, his fire-making kit, the tools without which survival on the frontier was nearly impossible, seemed to some who knew the situation like something more deliberate than simple desertion. It seemed like a man making sure there would be no witness to what he had done. By the time Glass found Fitzgerald in the spring or summer of 1824, the situation had changed in a way that made direct vengeance legally problematic and practically complicated. Fitzgerald had enlisted in the United States Army. He was now a soldier stationed at Fort Atkinson on the Missouri River in what is now Nebraska, a federal installation under military law within the jurisdiction of United States authority. Killing A US Army soldier was not a crime that the frontier's informal justice system could quietly absorb. It would be murder, with consequences that would follow Glass for the rest of his life. He arrived at Fort Atkinson and found Fitzgerald. Accounts of this meeting are sparse and filtered through time, but the general shape of it is consistent across multiple sources. Glass confronted Fitzgerald with all the controlled fury of a man who has had months to rehearse the confrontation in his mind and arrive at a precise accounting of what he actually wanted from it. He wanted his rifle. He wanted Fitzgerald to look at him and know what he had done. He wanted the acknowledgement. Whether he got the acknowledgement is not recorded. What is recorded is that the commanding officer at Fort Atkinson, aware of what was happening, intervened, told Glass that killing a US soldier would be murder, regardless of what the soldier had done on the frontier, and that the army was not going to permit a man to be killed on its installation. He urged Glass, in terms that were apparently fairly direct, to take his rifle and leave. Glass took his rifle. He left. He had walked approximately 1,000 miles, survived conditions that should have killed him several times over, and arrived, at his revenge, to find that civilization had gotten there first and made the simple solution impossible. He made the same choice he had made with the young man. He walked away. There is a kind of wisdom in this that is easy to undervalue. Glass had crossed the continent on the engine of his rage, and when he arrived and found that the rage could not be cleanly discharged, he did not let it consume him. He did not throw his life away over a man who was not worth it. He picked up his rifle. His rifle, which had traveled with him for years, which was in a real sense an extension of his identity in the world he inhabited. And he walked back into the wilderness. Back to work. Back to the mountains. Hugh Glass lived for approximately another decade after the bear attack, and those 10 years have a quality of the legendary even beyond the survival story itself. He moved through the fur trade world like a man who had already been to the other side of death and found it less frightening than expected, with a kind of freedom that comes from having survived the worst thing you can imagine and discovered that you are still, fundamentally, yourself. He trapped beaver in the high country. He was at the 1825 rendezvous on the Green River, that great annual fair of the mountain men, and at subsequent rendezvous through the late 1820s. He guided expeditions, he scouted, he did all the things that mountain men did, doing them with the particular authority of a man whose reputation preceded him into every camp and fort and trading post on the frontier. Because by the mid-1820s, his story was known. The fur trade world was small, and its internal communications were faster than one might imagine. Word traveled between trading posts and winter camps and summer rendezvous with remarkable efficiency, carried by the men themselves, refined and elaborated in the telling, until Hugh Glass's story had become one of the foundational legends of the entire enterprise. Every mountain man knew it. Every new arrival to the trade heard it within weeks of signing on. The story had a moral, or several morals, depending on how you told it, and the mountain men told it in the version that suited the moment. Sometimes it was about survival, about what the human body could endure when the will was strong enough. Sometimes it was about betrayal and its consequences. Sometimes it was about mercy, about the choice Glass had made twice to walk away from the men who had wronged him. Sometimes it was simply a good story, told around a fire on a winter night, that served the same purpose all good stories serve, reminding people of the range of what is possible. Glass himself said very little about it by most accounts. He was not a talkative man, and he was not a man who traded on his own legend. When new men asked him about the bear, and they all asked him about the bear, he apparently gave brief, factual answers and then changed the subject. The wounds on his back, which had healed into scars of considerable size and dramatic appearance, were visible when he removed his shirt, and these were considered adequate testimony. In the fall of 1833, a party of trappers, including Hugh Glass, was attacked by Arikara warriors on the Yellowstone River near its confluence with the Missouri. Glass was killed. He was approximately 50 years old, which was elderly by mountain man standards, and he had spent most of those 50 years in conditions of sustained physical difficulty that would have destroyed most people at 30. The Exact circumstances of his death are, like almost everything about Hugh Glass, not fully documented. He was on the ice of the Yellowstone River, winter trapping, moving through the season that was always the most dangerous, when the Arikara came. There may have been 3 men in the party. All 3 were killed. The bodies were found later. Mai died in the field, doing the work in the country he had spent his life moving through. There was no deathbed. There was no last speech. There was the river and the ice and the winter sky, and then there was not. The mountain men buried him, or more likely, given the season and the location, left him in the river, as was sometimes done, and moved on, because that was what you did, and because the wilderness did not pause for grief, and because Hugh Glass, of all people, would have understood this completely. Every culture has its survival stories. Every tradition that has ever tried to understand what human beings are capable of has told stories of people who endured the unendurable and came out the other side changed, or didn't come out the other side at all but went down fighting, which amounts to the same testimony from a different angle. These stories persist because they answer a question that never stops being asked. What am I made of? What would I do? Hugh Glass's story answers this question in a particular way, with a particular emphasis that sets it apart from other survival narratives. It is not simply a story about physical toughness, though he was physically as tough as any person whose story we have. It is not simply a story about the human will to survive, though his will was extraordinary. It is a story about what happens to anger over time, and about the surprising things that grief and pain and distance can do to a person's sense of what they actually want. He wanted his rifle. He wanted to be seen. He wanted the men who had wronged him to know that they had not succeeded in erasing him, that he had survived their abandonment and the bear and the wilderness and the 200-mile crawl and the Arikara and the winter, that he was still here, that he refused, fundamentally and completely, to be finished. And then, having established all of this beyond any possible doubt, he let them live. Twice. He chose the living of his own life over the taking of theirs. He picked up his rifle and walked back into the mountains, where the work was, where the rivers were cold and the beaver moved under the ice and the sky was enormous and the grizzly bears moved through the timber with their ancient, indifferent power, and he trapped and guided and existed for another decade in the fullest possible use of the word. This choice, to live rather than to consume himself in vengeance, is, in the end, the most human thing about him. More human than the crawl, which was animal in the best sense, driven by the body's refusal to stop. The choice not to kill, made twice, deliberately, in full possession of the alternative. That is the mark of a person who has understood something important about what a life is for. Jim Bridger, if it was Bridger, carried the guilt of what he had done to Glass for the rest of his long life. He lived until 1881, becoming one of the most celebrated figures of the mountain man era, a guide and scout of extraordinary reputation, a man whose geographical knowledge of the West was unmatched. He spoke of Glass in old age, apparently, with a remorse that had not faded with the years. The young man who had been too frightened to keep his word grew into a man who never forgot the cost of that failure. John Fitzgerald disappears from history after Fort Atkinson. He served in the army and then is not recorded. Whatever he carried from his encounter with Hugh Glass, he carried it alone and took it with him. Glass himself left no writing, no direct testimony, no account in his own words. He was illiterate, as most mountain men were, and even if he had been literate, he does not seem to have been a man inclined towards self-examination on paper. What we have of him is the trace he left in other people's accounts, the shape of his story in the telling of those who knew him or knew people who knew him, the physical record of what he did, which is enough, more than enough. The crawl itself is the testament. Part 10. The last wind, drifting towards sleep. Think of him now in the way you think of someone just before sleep comes, not with analysis, not with the weight of history and its judgments, but with the quiet attention you give to something that has moved you without being able to fully say why. A big man in his 40s, weathered and scarred, moving through an enormous landscape. the Black Hills in the distance, dark and pine-covered. The sky above the Dakota breaks so wide it seems to extend in all directions simultaneously, as if sky is what the world is made of and everything solid is just a temporary arrangement within it. The creek bottoms full of cottonwoods going yellow in the October light. The cold coming down from the north with its clean mineral smell. He moves with a slight limp, his right, leg slightly uneven in its step, the remnant of a break that healed without a physician's attention and left its mark permanently. His back, under his shirt, is a map of what happened to him. A topography of scar tissue, ridged and irregular, the record written on his body of a single August afternoon in 1823 that lasted the rest of his life. He is checking his traps in the early morning, moving along a creek in the cold before the sun has fully risen, the water dark and still in the shadow of the cut bank, a thin rime of ice at the edges beginning to melt in the first light. He is completely present in this moment. He is not thinking about the bear, or about Fitzgerald, or about the young man whose face he no longer quite remembers, or about Fort Kiowa, or about the weeks of crawling that still visit him sometimes in dreams. He is watching the water. He is watching the bank. He is reading the country the way he has read it for 30 years, with the total, practiced attention of a man whose life has depended on getting this right. A beaver slips into the water 20 yards upstream and is gone. He notes this without moving, watches the circles spread and fade, calculates where the animal is probably headed, adjusts his route accordingly. The sun clears the ridge to the east and the creek lights up, every stone visible through the clear, cold water, the ice at the edges catching the light and holding it, the cottonwood leaves above him stirring in a breath of wind that carries the smell of pine from the hills to the west. It is beautiful. It is extraordinarily, improbably, stubbornly beautiful. He knows this. You can tell he knows this by the way he pauses for just a moment, standing in the creek in the early light, not moving, just there, alive, after everything, alive, in this place, which is the right place, doing this work, which is the right work. The moment passes. He moves on upstream. The creek bends, and the cottonwoods close behind him. And then he is gone, back into the country that was his home, back into the enormous American wilderness of 1828 or 1830, or whenever this morning is, back into the life that the bear tried to take from him and could not. A note on history: Hugh Glass is one of the most famous and least documented figures of the American frontier. The core facts of his story, the bear attack, the abandonment, the survival crawl, the eventual confrontations with the men who left him, are supported by contemporary accounts. Most importantly, a letter written in 1825 by a fur trade contemporary named Hall Jackson Kelly, and by accounts collected from mountain men in the decades following. The details, however, are disputed by historians, and the complete picture of his life before and after the attack is largely reconstruction. The identification of Jim Bridger as one of the men who abandoned Glass is historically uncertain, though it appears in multiple early accounts, and Bridger himself apparently acknowledged some version of it in old age. The other man, John Fitzgerald, is more consistently identified across sources. Glass's Pawnee captivity story is found in early accounts, but cannot be independently verified. His death on the Yellowstone in the winter of 1832 to 1833 is the most consistently documented event in his post-bear life. The film The Revenant, 2015, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, takes substantial creative liberties with the historical record, including a son for Glass who did not exist in any documented account, and a final confrontation with Fitzgerald that did not happen as depicted. The real story, as told here, is in most respects more interesting and more morally complex than the film's version, as real stories tend to be. The Grand River still flows through northwestern South Dakota. The Black Hills are still there, the plum thickets and chokecherry bushes still fruit in late August. And somewhere in that country, in a landscape that has changed less than almost anywhere in the continental United States, is the place where Hugh Glass woke up alone and decided, for reasons that remain entirely his own, to keep going. Good night.